All right, here we go. We start at the beginning. And the beginning is democracy. After all, this is American government. What's more elemental to the concept of American government than the concept of democracy? We are a democratic republic, by God. So it makes sense to start there. And that's why the first in our series of lectures here in AP Gov is about the topic of democracy. So we start from the very beginning. We go back to the ancient Greeks. Indeed, the root word democracy comes from the ancient Greek. It is, now I'm going to admit, not a French guy, Spanish guy. Well, English guy first, Spanish guy secondarily, if you believe the College Board, at passable level of knowledge, since I passed AP Gov about 172 years ago. But I believe the word's pronounced portmanteau. I think the T's silent. It might be portmanteau, it might be portmanteau, because all the T's are silent. Hell, I don't know. But what it is, it's a fancy vocab word, and it means when you put two words together, like gridlock or houseboat. This one is a poor man whatever of two different Greek words. Demos, meaning people, and kratia, which means authority or rule. So if you want to know what democracy means, effectively, when you get right down to it, when you strip it to its most basic ingredients, it means people have authority or people rule. Or if you prefer to put it the other way, if that makes your flow feel better, rule by the people, authority by the people. However you want to put that. Now, that's a pretty broad concept. It may not seem like it because you and I, we've become accustomed to a particular form, a particular way of democratic structure that works very well for us and has for 247 years. But, well, more often than not. But just about every organized government in the world considers themselves to be a democracy of some point. Back in the days of the Cold War, for example, the Anglicanized name for North Korea was the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. East Germany, which was the part of Germany, the subset of Germany that was behind the Iron Curtain, was known as the German Democratic Republic. So they do consider themselves to be democracies as well. So for the sake of simplicity, we're going to narrow this down to three different groups. And the dividing line here is going to be fairly simple. The dividing line is going to be the simple idea of what we would call individual decision-making authority. That is to say, this is going to be a spectrum, okay? A spectrum where we're going to look at these three different types of democracies, if we want to call them that, and we're going to base it on a very simple premise, and that simple premise is how much individual decision-making authority is granted under each of these systems. Easy enough, fair enough, right? So we're going to start with the one that almost no one here would think is a democracy. We're going to start with the Cubas, the North Koreas, the Iraqs and the era of Saddam Hussein of the world, what we call democratic centralism. So North Korea is considered a repressive regime by most people. The most recent departed guest of the White House may have other thoughts on it. He seemed to like that guy a little bit. But the MUN folks in the House, they know the full English name, again, not the native name, but the English name of the nation is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. If you put it on a little placard at a conference somewhere in some far-flung place, they may just put DPRK for short. By the way, for those scoring at home, South Korea, known as the Republic of Korea, just ROK, which I always thought meant like rock, and I thought that was kind of cool. But alas, it just means Republic of Korea. It's an acronym. Oh well. So how can North Korea, which has been run by the same father and son combination since, I think, pretty damn close to before I was born. I think it was before I was born, in fact. How can we consider that to be a place with no free elections of anybody? How can we consider that to be a democracy? Well, we wouldn't. How do they consider themselves to be a democracy might be the better question. So, first of all, let's define our terms. Democratic centralism is when power is concentrated either in a single hand, something we call tyranny, or a small set of hands, which we call by the name oligarchy. Now, those of you who are familiar with social studies a little bit and are fans of the genre, you're probably sitting there saying nobody thinks tyranny or an oligarchy is a democracy. Well, they do. I would tend to agree with you. But they do. Why do they? Well, it actually is pretty simple, okay? The idea here is that that person or that small group claims that they speak for the entirety of the people, which is a pretty arrogant presumption, but it is just that, an arrogant presumption. I'll give you an example. Years and years ago, probably 20 years ago at this point, the cable news network, CNN, did a phenomenal documentary series on the Cold War. Really, really well done. And either as part of the documentary series or as a set of interviews to, for lack of a better word, hype the series, they actually scored an interview with Fidel Castro, the one-time and long-time leader of communist Cuba. And at one point in the interview, the interviewer asked what I thought was a pretty interesting question, which was, at this point, Castro had been in power in Cuba for going on 40 years. And the reporter for CNN asked, how can you consider yourself to be a representative of your people when you don't give them any choices? You're just assuming they would want you to be in power all these 40 years. You don't have free and fair elections. You've never put your own leadership up to a vote. How can you consider that you speak for the people? And Castro had a really funny answer. Not funny, ha-ha, but a peculiar answer and an interesting one. What Castro said effectively, and I'm paraphrasing here because one, I don't speak Spanish, and two, who knows what the translator was translating, but I'm going to paraphrase. Effectively what he said was that I am one of these people. I am not a member of the elite. I was a common man, like there are common men and women all over Cuba, and I know what they want because I came from them. I sprang from this, working class, peasant class, whatever you want to call it, which is kind of true. He was not a member of the political or the economic elite prior to the revolution in 1959. In fact, some of you might know this, but not a lot of you do. His profession of sorts, he was a baseball player. He actually had ambition of being a major league baseball player up till about 1950 or so. Actually had some tryouts with a couple major league clubs here in the United States and never caught on. So, for the want of an arm out of the bullpen, we might have avoided an entire revolution in Cuba, but he, of course, didn't catch on as a Major League Baseball player, went home to Cuba and got into politics. And the rest, as they say, is history. But his argument is an interesting one. The basically, effectively, I know what the people want better than they do argument. And that is a commonly held argument throughout that particular end of the spectrum of democracies, if we want to call it that. So is there anything positive to say about this system? Very little. You can make an argument that in a very short-run situation, that they may actually be more efficient than comparable democracies because there's not a lot of debate that needs to go on. There's not a lot of voices that need to be brought into the equation before decisions get made. So that was one thing that was brought up in the propaganda films of the 1930s shown here in the States. For those who don't know, in the 1930s, the Soviet Union and their allies here in the United States, and there was a budding communist movement here in the United States, because, of course, in the middle of the Great Depression. And when times are hard, people are willing to take more drastic measures. So they produced these propaganda films, and one of the things they said was, well, you in America and you in the rest of Europe, you guys have a Great Depression. Here in the Soviet Union, we have no depression. We met the challenges of the depression, we made changes immediately, and here we are as prosperous as ever, blah, blah, blah. Which was probably not true. These, of course, were propaganda films. But it is at least theoretically true that they could make quicker responses to crisis than an elective democracy where it would have to go through an elected legislature. And if the public opinion has to be taken into account, it may take longer. If it's an issue where the two political main entities, like here in the States, or multiple political entities in a place like Great Britain or Australia, are fundamental disagreement on it, it may take even longer. So real true democracy is messy. It's very messy. You need to take into account a lot of different opinions. There are processes that need to be undertaken. There is a procedure, and that procedure is not always not always fast or efficient. Think of just some of the political issues, and I'm not going to name any because I really don't want to get in trouble on day one here, that people on either side of the political spectrum have been literally waiting for decades to see some resolution on. Okay, why haven't there been resolutions on those things? And the short answer to that question is because the system is messy. It's meant to be messy because our priority is not to make decisions immediately. Our priority is to make sure that the greatest multiplicity of voices are heard. Again, at least in theory. So what's the negative? Is there a negative? Yeah, there are a ton of negatives. Now, it's worth noting that the clear drawback here, and there are several, is that very few voices are heard. Now, that's bad on a couple different levels. One, it runs counter to our conception of what democracy actually is, which is the people ruling, which means the people, the widest multiplicity of people having the greatest amount of say. And even that's not entirely true, but I'll get to that in just a minute. But the bottom line is, we would never consider a centralist state where one person makes all the decisions or a small handful of people make the decisions to be a true democracy. But there's actually a bigger practical problem with this lack of individual decision-making authority. And it is as simple as this. People are fallible. We F up. We make mistakes, right? Now, the beauty of being in a large system where there is individual decision-making authority and individual ability to register opinion and register concepts is the fact that if someone makes a decision or is on the cusp of making a decision that's a poor decision, there will be other voices in the room to say, hey, no, don't do that. Here's why it's a bad idea. Or how about this instead, right? That's our system. Our system is based on this kind of feedback loop. Well, in a democratic centralist state, the answer to that is no, that's not how it goes down. In a democratic centralist state, rather, that one person, that one small group makes a decision and nobody contradicts it. Often because to do so is a very dangerous gesture indeed. It was rather famously known, for example, in Saddam Hussein's Iraq that he had family members. I don't remember if it was a brother-in-law or a cousin or a nephew or what it was, but he had family members put to prison or put to death because they were vocal opponents of particular policies he was pursuing. So, it's like the old rule of the prison. If they're willing to do that to their own family, what the hell are they going to do to you? Now, some of you might be wondering, Singiser, have you been to prison? The answer is no, I have not. However, I will tell you just a quick story, because why not? It's tangent, but it's a good one. When I was at UCLA, we had a class called Violence in America. It was taught by one of the most renowned professors on cult behavior in America. His name was Dr. Louis Jolyon West. He just passed away a few years back. Well, Dr. West one day was talking about the Menendez brothers. Now, this is way before y'all's time, but the Menendez brothers were these two preppy brothers. I think they were a year apart. I think they were 1918, 1817, something like that. Very wealthy, lived in Beverly Hills, who killed their parents. They claimed because they were the victims of abuse. The prosecutors claimed because they were after the family money. They were convicted. They did go to prison. And Dr. West did some of his work in prisons. And one of the things he said that just blew me away was these hardened criminals, these guys that were in gangs, these guys that were yoked to the moon and jacked up and perpetually violent, would not go near the Menendez brothers, who were these two nerdy little preppy rich kids who physically more imposing than either of them, and I'm not physically imposing at all, right? And the reason why they gave was if they did that to their own parents, they're not going to give a shit about me. Fair point. Same thing here. So in a democratic centralist state, that iron fist of rule has a practical policy-related downside. And that downside is that when the leader makes mistakes, and everyone will, there's nobody there to correct it, to offer alternatives, and the like. So if this is on the spectrum of having the least amount of individual decision-making authority, what's on the other end of the spectrum? Well, here's a hint. It's a system we have, but only in limited doses. And that's something called direct democracy. Now, ballot measures, like the ones last November on abortion and on sports betting, are examples of what we call direct democracy. It says last year's recall election of Governor Newsom. I confess I should have edited this a little better. That actually happened in 2021, so it was 2 years ago. But the recall of Governor Newsom is another example of direct democracy. Direct democracy, by definition, is when the whole of decision-making authority is placed into the hands of the citizenry. So we don't just get to vote for somebody who's going to make laws. We get to vote on laws. We get to actually make policy-related decisions. Now, this is probably the closest we get to the original Aristotelian notions of democracy. The people truly ruling, the demos getting down with the kratia here, okay? Now, there is something that needs to be understood, though, and that is that, as has been the case since the days of the city-states of the Peloponnesus, and as it was in the New England town halls and as it is today, there's still an open question of deciding who gets to participate. So when I say this has the highest degree of individual decision-making authority, that's not for everybody. That would not include, for example, many of y'all, because you're not yet 18. And in our country, unless you've reached the age of 18, you're not eligible to vote. Of course, until 1971, that was 21 years of age. If you are not a citizen, if you're just here as a resident of this country but have not yet attained citizenship, you do not have the right to vote in federal elections. If you are somebody who has been convicted of a felony and incarcerated for a felony, state by state, depending on the individual rules of each individual state, you may not have the ability to vote. So, and of course, at various points in our histories, people of color couldn't vote, people without property couldn't vote, women couldn't vote. So there's been these conditions and restrictions as long as we've had a country. So the positive of the direct democracy structure is that it is the most small d democratic. Now, when I say small d democratic, that means not Democratic Party versus Republican Party, just the function of democracy. It allows the most people to participate at the highest personal level. That's a perfect level, that's wrong. Personal level. But it's not a perfect system, which is why we only use it in small doses. How many times in a typical year will a California voter get to exercise direct democracy? Depends on the year, but 5 to 15 times at most. Now, why is that? Well, there's an obvious answer here, and the obvious answer is it takes a tremendous amount of knowledge to be a lawmaker. You need to understand what the policies are. You need to understand what your vote for or against that measure will create. Now, here's the thing. We all have other jobs. So I don't know if you know this. If you're a registered voter, you probably do. If you don't, you probably don't, which is fine. But every year, the California Secretary of State's office will issue a pamphlet. It's a booklet, probably 50 to 100 pages maybe, on that year's ballot measures, on the direct democracy the voters will be called upon to vote on. And it has every individual proposition. It has the legislative analyst's analysis of it. It has the title of it and it has the text of the law, for those who can read legal jargon, which I'll be the first to admit I cannot. It also has arguments for and against submitted by interested parties. It's a really neat, really informative document. And I would bet you, with all the cash I have in my pocket right now, that less than 5% of the California public reads it. Why? Well, for one thing, it's 100 pages. That's a lot of reading. It is the textbook definition of TLDR. But also, we all do something else, or almost all of us do something else for a living besides make policy, right? I teach government and history. My wife is an architect. My sister-in-law is the manager of a grocery store. My nephew is a pharmaceutical rep. I mean, we all have other jobs. Mine's probably the only one that is remotely close. My brother teaches, but he teaches PE. I'm probably the only one that's remotely close to the issue of governing and policy, and I'm going to be the first to admit, even I don't read the thing, because I'm busy reading y'all's stuff, and I'm busy reading content for the classroom. So I might give it a quick skim, but I'm not going to be reading it cover to cover either. Most people don't. So you could make an argument, and I think it'd be a fair argument, that I lack the real credentials to make these decisions, and I'm probably more qualified to do it than 98% of the voting public, because at least this is what I do for a living, right? I'm guessing that Gus, who works at the convenience store over on Aviation, probably does not have a lot of governing experience either, and probably less interest in it because he ain't making his career out of it, right? Or my brother, the PE teacher, who hates politics. So most of us don't have the level of interest in politics that would be required to make these kind of policy decisions all the time. And even if we had the interest, we don't have the time. Gus at the convenience store, okay? Convenience store jobs do not pay well. I know people who work them, present tense. So probably Gus has got a second job, okay? Maybe he drives an Uber. Maybe he works clerking at a grocery store. Who knows? So let's say Gus works 2 jobs. Gus is working 12, 14 hours a day. You really think when he gets home after that day's work, gets back to his home, gets back to his apartment, he's going to get some food, pop open a beverage, and start reading up on abortion and foreign policy and water rights and all the other things that were on propositions last year? Probably not. Even if he had an interest. My guess is in the very few hours that Gus has, he's probably going to spend time with his family, or he's probably going to entertain himself by watching something on TV, whether it's a Dodger game or, binge watches some show, whatever, right? Like most of us. Most of us, when we get free time, can find ways to spend it that have nothing to do with public policy. The other problem with direct democracy, while we only use it in small doses, is it's still subject to a certain extent to elite influence. No, it's not one person making all the decisions, but big money entities can influence our votes. The most famous example of this was actually my senior thesis at UCLA, was on the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry, and this is a very health-conscious state, California is. The tobacco industry had done a phenomenal job, an unbelievable job, of stopping ballot initiatives relating to tobacco. They were undefeated from the early 80s until 1993. And then they finally lost one, and they lost it by like 2 or 3 percentage points. It was, I think, 48% voted yes on their proposition, and 52% voted no, or 49-51 it might have been. It was 30 years ago, so I can't say I remember off the top of my head. The point is that they still almost won then, and even more recently in 2005, proponents of trying to limit tobacco usage put a very steep tax on cigarettes on the ballot. And this is California, where only about 12% of the public smokes. And this is the pre-vaping days, so that wasn't an alternative. I want to say that tax only got 51% of the vote, because the tobacco industry literally spent tens of millions of dollars on advertising, convincing people that this was bad for American businesses and bad for the people, and if they could tax this, what'll they tax next, and all these other arguments that wound up being pretty successful and almost led them to victory. So direct democracy, because we are searching for information, we don't want to have to look too high or too low. One of the biggest, even bigger than a lot of candidate races, these ballot initiatives just suck in money. Industries that are about to be regulated. Very famously, there was a proposition on the ballot in 2020 or 21 trying to regulate Uber and Lyft, force them to treat their employees like employees, not as contract workers. And anybody wants to know the distinction, you can ask me at office hours or whatever, but it's a big distinction. It puts a lot more responsibility on Uber and Lyft, and Uber and Lyft spent way more than they would ever have spent giving their workers proper health benefits, pay, whatever, to block this proposition, and they won. They were playing the long game, because if they give the workers that, it's that way for the rest of their lives. But if they can kick the can down the road another 5 years, another 10 years, then it's worth the $100 million they spent back 2-3 years ago. All right, so if we're not really practitioners of direct democracy, which is the greatest amount of individual decision-making authority, and we sure would not like to be part of that democratic centralism where we have basically none, where are we? We are in this last and final category, and that is, ta-da, representative democracy. Most of the governing that goes on in the United States, in fact, I'll go further, most of the elected democracies utilize representative democracy. Virtually all of them do. So what is, in the modern era, I'd go so far as to say all elective democracies do. I'm trying to think of one that doesn't. There's some that are a little more reliant on direct democracy that we just talked about. But in a representative democracy, we hold elections. The time between elections varies. Here in California, governors 4 years, state assemblies 2, state senate and all the other statewide, what we call row offices, the other statewide offices, is 4. The U.S. Senate at the federal level is 6. Every state's parameters are different. In New Hampshire, for example, they reelect their governor every 2 years. Why? Couldn't tell you. Back in the colonial days, Massachusetts reelected everybody every year. So in a representative democracy, we hold these periodic elections to select people who will become makers of law on our behalf. Now, to ensure those people, representatives, hence the name, respect the will of the citizenry, their power is subject to review in what we call terms. So in other words, we hold these elections. Well, once that person's elected, they have to come back and seek election again and again and again. And in a lot of states, we only let them seek a certain number of terms. For example, here in California, our governors can only serve 2 terms. Our state assembly members, I think, get 3 or 4. I think they get 4 terms, 4 2-year terms or 8 years. And I think our state senators get 2 4-year terms or 8 years. It might be 6 and 3 to get 12 years. I can't remember off the top of my head. Point is, they get a certain number of chances to keep the job. But the key thing here, for our understanding, is they have to fight to keep the job. Okay? They have to actually seek the consistent approval of their citizenry. And by office and office, it varies. And of course, famously, for federal judges, there is no election because, as we'll talk about later when we get to the judicial system, the logic of that, in case you were ever wondering, is we want those people to make decisions immune from political impulse. In other words, we don't want our judges saying, I better vote this way even though I don't believe it's right because I won't get reelected if I take the unpopular stand. That's the logic, okay? But that's not true for our elected officials. Our elected officials are representatives. That's what we call them. So we expect them to be solicitous of our views, to seek our views, and to act upon our views. So that's why representative democracy is named as it is. Now, the difference between representative democracy and direct democracy is actually pretty simple. In direct democracy, we make these policy decisions. We have to take it upon ourselves to learn about all these matters of policy. In representative democracy, we are freed up from that obligation. Instead, we pick somebody else, and that becomes, in most states, their full-time job. For example, here in California, all our California state legislators, our 80 assembly members and our 40 Senate members, that's their full-time job. So a person like Al Muratsuchi, who is our local state assembly representative, he does not have to think about what policies matter to him after his day at the law firm or his day at the family business. The business is politics. That is his full-time job. And some people kind of bristle at that, like, oh, we have professional politicians. And I understand that sentiment, I do, but by the same token, that's what makes a representative democracy more effective, is that's all these people have to worry about. So in theory, and I acknowledge the word theory there is doing a lot of work, but in theory, they should make more informed decisions at least, because they actually have the time, and in fact, it is in their job description to become conversant on these issues. Now, they have ways of being helped with that, things we'll get to as the class goes along, but just bear in mind that that's why we have representative democracy, because that's their full-time job now. So now we don't have to kind of, during the day do X and at night become lawmakers. We just do our jobs. We contribute our contribution to society, whatever that might be, and we turn to representatives to do the lawmaking on our behalf. And if we don't like the laws they're pursuing, if we don't like the votes they're making, we have the periodic opportunity to boot their ass out and put somebody new in their place. So the reason that the United States uses this system is because it is a compromise. It allows us decision-making power. We still are in control, but we do not have to become experts on public policy, which, as I said in the previous discussion on direct democracy, that's not something that we either have the time or the inclination to pursue, quite frankly. Okay? Now, that is sort of the balance. It's not a perfect system, of course. It still requires voter commitment, because you've got to figure out which of the candidates running comes closer to your vision. And of course, if you are not terribly ideological, you're probably going to be in the uncomfortable position of finding that neither candidate meshes with you particularly well. So then it becomes, as we talk about all the time in American politics, the lesser of two evils. Okay, I'm not a fan of X and I'm not a fan of Y, but X and Y are the choices I have. So it stops becoming a contest of who is exactly like me ideologically, and it becomes more a battle of, okay, who will I feel less gross about being in charge? You still have the issue of money and elite influence, although that is, hopefully, and we only have about a decade's worth of data on this, that might finally be somewhat diminishing because of the ability of smaller campaigns to get their message out through the internet, to raise money through online resources, which has allowed fairly non-elite citizens to raise just crazy amounts of money. Katie Porter, who is now running for the U.S. Senate, she served, is in her third or fourth term. I think she is now on term number 3 in the United States House of Representatives. When she ran for office in 2018, she was a little-known, underfunded law school professor from UC Irvine. But she ran a really strong online campaign, raised a ton of money, and next thing you know, she's a congresswoman, and now she's potentially a senator. I think that's effective these days in a way that it wasn't 25 years ago, where you really had to rely on these sort of old school official channels of fundraising. But again, it's not perfect. We still deal with the impact of money, because if someone can buy a lot of ads and put them on the radio or put them on the internet, that'll help, especially in the smaller the campaign, the more those things matter. We still expect voters to understand why they're voting the way they are, and that's by no means a guarantee. I will tell the story. It's telling on someone that I don't know, and I feel bad about that. But the last campaign that I worked on, one of the last, I worked on a few after this, but the one I worked on probably with a fair amount of time was the 2000 congressional campaign, year 2000. And I was volunteering on behalf of a Democratic candidate out in the San Gabriel Valley. And I was knocking on doors in South Pasadena. I knocked on the door of this beautiful estate. Beautiful home. Beautiful. Freaked me out because the woman answered the door just as I was knocking on it. So my hand went through and I freaked me out. And I scared her. She scared me. She was going to her car. I laughed it off. I'm like, just reminding everybody to vote today. Hoping you'll get out and vote for Al Gore and Adam Schiff. Yes, the same Adam Schiff. This was his actual first campaign for Congress back in the year 2000. And the woman says, "Oh, I'm definitely voting for Vice President Gore and Mr. Schiff because I always vote for Republicans." Well, for those who don't know why that's a cringe, Al Gore, who had been vice president at this point, mind you, for 8 years, and Adam Schiff were both Democrats. So it's kind of an uncomfortable position. I honestly didn't know what to do. I'm like, do I correct her? Because then she might get mad at me. Or do I just kind of say, have a nice day? And that's what I just, thank you, ma'am, have a nice day. And I went on my way, but I was like, wow. This is a woman, look, based on the house, family's pulling down mid 6 figures conservatively, and probably more than that. And the vice president's been a Democrat for 8 years, and she had no clue. So, yeah, that's still a problem. All right, so we've kind of hit the basic elements of democracy as a general concept. From this point forward, we get specific to American government. We'll start that process as we go along sooner rather than later. But for today, by God, we are done.